So the title of this talk is not particularly ironic. At first glance, it might be difficult to conceive of exactly what kind of wisdom addicts might have to impart, right? I'm not talking about active addicts, I'm talking about recovering addicts. And of course, the word addict is the word we use in general to describe ourselves, even when we are many years in recovery, right? So immediately we hit on a controversy there, which is that most mental health professionals do not like this word addict and would dearly like us to stop using it. We've got to stop needlessly shaming ourselves, they tell us. It's no good for our mental health, it's a negative label, and so on and so forth. You know, addicts are victims, victims should not be stigmatized, to which we would probably say something like, well, we'll be the judge of that, thanks very much. It's almost always mental health professionals who've got no skin in the game. They're not in recovery themselves, they are not in recovery from addiction. They misunderstand the intention and the usefulness of that label. So I've talked about this before, but I think we'll dig into this a little bit here. So what we're doing, we are not smearing ourselves unnecessarily with labels. We are reminding ourselves that there is a predator at large. And that predator is us. Me, myself. I am the predator in that sense. My own brain is the problem, right? So by positioning it in that way, it's a reminder to me that I am my own worst enemy, effectively. So in a sense, this is assuming responsibility for a thing, right? But assuming responsibility for things is not de rigueur these days, right? It's not the in thing, it's not a must, right? So we are living in an age that is kind of characterized by escapism and pleasure seeking and the blaming of others and other things for our own failings, right? So if I were to ask the average counsellor or social worker today, what causes addiction, for example, just to pick one of the main problems in society today, we would get a very clear and strident answer, right? It would be, well, we wouldn't hear anything about brains or genes. There wouldn't be much culpability afforded to the sort of wide availability of illicit drugs. The answer would be very singular and very confidently expressed. It's childhood trauma and adversity, is what they'd say, and poverty and inequality and this type of thing. That's what causes addiction. And that kind of dogma shouts at us, you know, from every magazine, every newspaper, 1,000 academic journals, 100 best-selling books. It's become an unshakable bulwark in the mental health professions. The big bad world has daubed its horrors on us. You'd use drugs too if you'd had as hard a life as these poor victims. Life is just too painful to bear otherwise. And the hugely patronizing upshot of this, of course, I'm being patronizing, but I'm making fun of just how patronizing that is, right? It's incredibly patronizing because it says that addicts are helpless, mangled creatures with no agency, right? So that's why we inject ourselves with drugs and so on and so forth. Or at least this is what they tell us. So they are the mental health establishment, academics, academic and clinical psychologists, counselors, psychotherapists, life coaches, educators, professors, policymakers, authors. But therapists in particular have become a kind of new priesthood, and their word is gospel. And how they frame it is that what happened to us in our childhood is paramount. Now, there's an awful lot of very intelligent people who would just counter that immediately. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole in this talk. I'm just going to say that I don't think it's true that that's the case, that a difficult childhood means you cannot move forward until those traumas are removed. Oftentimes, these traumas are not forthcoming anyway. When you start to talk to people with addiction issues, they're absent. They haven't had any significant traumas oftentimes, and so the search, what happens in a lot of treatment centres and counselling centres is there begins a kind of search for this mysterious hidden trauma. Right, that's how it's then framed. It must be hidden because it's not apparent. Well, it's not apparent because it's not there. Right, so if you work in private addiction treatment centres in particular, these days you'll find that most people think they're traumatized, or they have this thing called trauma that psychologists have told them they have. But of course, because they come from pretty decent backgrounds, because they're accessing private healthcare, what you find is very little of that. It's just Freudian mumbo-jumbo dressed up in modern garb. And we're effectively using a kind of warmed-up version of a 100-year-old philosophy to treat a modern addiction pandemic, right? That's what's going on. It also doesn't seem to have occurred to these practitioners to ask themselves, are we really traumatized? Clearly, we are the least traumatized generation that has ever existed in the world, right? To think otherwise is ridiculous, right? What we should be asking ourselves is, how did the former generations cope with their much more significant and real traumas? If you look at the modern world, the comforts, the support, the involvement of the state, and at every level of life, we are without doubt the least traumatized generation that's ever lived. But that never seems to occur to people, to ask that question, why all this trauma when we are in fact safer than we've ever been? So, as I've argued in other videos, in the 1990s, psychology began to take a seriously wrong turn. And it started to impress on us a fragility model of mental health, which painted us as unresilient creatures, right? When in reality, we're anything but. Obviously, we wouldn't have made it this far otherwise. And this fragility model is now creating a victim mentality in our society, which is pretty close to being out of control. It's a type of groupthink that desperately needs challenging. And so in essence, that's what this channel is, not just this video. This channel is really an attempt to challenge that and put forward something like the Wisdom of Addicts as an antidote. Because I think they are really mutually exclusive. The type of wisdom that recovering addicts need to learn as they are learning to live their life without relying on drugs and alcohol is the exact antidote to this kind of fragility-based thinking, which is taking over now, right? Specifically, I'd say recovering addicts have kind of found, almost under their own steam really, without the aid of psychological professionals, of course, how to live. And they've done that through things like 12-step fellowships. The 12-step movement is a mutual aid support movement. No involvement of the state, no involvement of universities or any kind of government body, no external funders, completely grassroots led, right? And what those groups have found is a way of living which is based on the assuming of total personal responsibility, which is about as opposite as the current type of groupthink that you could possibly imagine. And that is what then becomes the cornerstone of a successful life. And even if you do have significant trauma, that type of code of living is what's going to transmute it and change it. So we need to stop being seduced by the fragility model of mental health, and quickly. So this concept of fragility that I'm using, obviously it's not new. It's been explored by quite a few important books over the last 2 decades. So you've got, first of all, I'd say the polymath Nassim Taleb in his 2007 book, Black Swan. where he applied this idea mostly to financial systems and risk analysis and that sort of thing. And then in 2012, he developed the idea quite a lot further, actually, in his book, Anti-Fragile. And in that book, he explained that systems, and that includes humans, are not simply either fragile or resilient. They can be more than resilient. They can be anti-fragile. So, in other words, they get better with mishandling, within reason, obviously. And to think about it in developmental terms, human developmental terms, consider an Amazonian tribe who take their over-mothered young men and put their hands inside a glove full of bullet ants, right? It's a type of pain that's described as like being shot, right? It apparently results in the sort of temporary paralysis of both arms, hallucinations that can last several days. It's an initiation ceremony for young men, obviously. I'm glad we don't do that anymore, just in case you're wondering. But surely there's some middle ground here between this sort of brutal and sometimes actually even lethal initiation ceremonies of our warlike ancestors, and then on the other side, this sort of vitality-sapping world of safe spaces and participation medals and so on. So that either way, the idea that systems, including humans, that they need to be stressed in order to become stronger is not a new one, right? This is a very old idea. And it seems to be something that's sort of woven itself into the fabric of all human cultures until now, right? Another book about fragility was, which is a very well known one, is The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. So Jonathan Haidt is a psychologist. He's done a lot on moral psychology. And that particular book took the idea even further, in a sense, by investigating in depth the culture of safetyism and what they called vindictive protectiveness, I think that was their word for it, that had begun to permeate schools and universities from the early 2000s onwards. So they spoke in similar terms to Taleb, but they applied it to the academic arena instead. And its main point was that a kind of coddling culture had become endemic in the educational system from primary schools right through to universities. And this undermined the mental health of its students who were kind of learning to think in distorted ways. So, in detail, I mean, far from protecting young people, this coddling culture seems to actually increase the likelihood of poor mental health outcomes, right? It's producing people that are easily hurt and not able to withstand adult life in the way that humans used to be able to. And the obvious example being those safe spaces that were all the rage a while back and are probably still somewhat in place, that rooms where students could literally go to be protected from the things that they didn't want to hear in the lecture halls, right? So things like that are aggravating rather than solving mental health problems. So obviously on this channel I'm looking at not just addiction but mental health more widely. I am looking at how that mindset is becoming more prevalent, and I'm trying to challenge it and offer an alternative. And the alternative that is most obvious to me, and this has been mentioned by many other people, Michael Schellenberger noted this in passing in his book San Francisco, which is an excellent book about the perhaps well-intentioned but in the end utterly disastrous policies, harm minimization, harm reduction, drug policies that San Francisco implemented throughout the 2010s. And in that he met some people who had got clean from drugs. and they were all in the 12-step movement by and large. And their wisdom, which was pretty tough love based, not touchy-feely whatsoever, impressed itself on him. And he realized there was something in this, and he kind of did hint several times in the book that what if more people lived according to these principles? What if institutions and so on, like schools, guided themselves by these principles? Broadly speaking, principles of personal accountability is what 12-step groups like AA are known for. I'm going to go into more detail, but just to say, I'm not the first person that's thought of this, obviously. People mention it frequently in recovery circles, though I should add, without any particular desire to go and proselytize or make it happen, because that's not our tradition, right? But the traditional model, let's say, of addiction treatment used to be an abstinence-based model before harm reduction became very popular. And it grew out of, obviously, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, and their 12-step method, which is characterized by prioritizing abstinence from all mind-altering drugs. Probably wouldn't be a bad thing if everybody did that, would it? But that's not our business to force that on anyone. But isn't that a good start, being sober? You know, people who are sober, not on drugs, not on alcohol, at least they've got a nice ground zero kind of thing to start from, right? So that's the first thing to note. These mutual aid groups are characterized by abstinence. Then, especially where the addiction has been very severe, they engage a system of moral therapy. Now, moderns hate this word. It's another word that they hate. They hate the word addict because it's stigmatizing. They hate the word moral and words like virtue. They don't like it because of the connotations, I guess, to be fair. It has connotations of a much more judgmental former times when religious bodies were in charge of society and running schools and things like that, and when discipline was unfair, arbitrary and cruel. And so I suppose you can understand why people are a bit leery of this word. But this is literally the word that the early AAs used to describe their program. It's a program of moral therapy. Okay, stick with it. So recovery is defined as being sober, but also as having a life worth living. And in order to get that, when you've been living an addicted life, you need to engage a system of moral therapy. That's the unreconstituted, unpolitically correct standpoint of the early AAs in the 1930s, right? It's usually done via a sponsor who is a mentor who can take you through the 12 steps. And the 12 steps themselves are a kind of series of spoken and written exercises whereby you gain healing from your illness, which is regarded as a spiritual illness, not a psychological, genetic, behavioral illness. I now think it is brain-based and behavioral, but we know where they're coming from. When they say spiritual, I think that doesn't necessarily preclude the idea that it could also be neurological issues going on, right? So these series of spoken and written exercises, the 12 steps, are a system of moral therapy that help recovering addicts to assume pretty radical levels of personal responsibility for their actions, including retrospectively, right? And over the years, obviously, AA has become a central part of American life, right? It's so much so that the original text, the self-titled book, Alcoholics Anonymous, known as the Big Book, was listed by the Library of Congress as one of 88 books that shaped America. And in that list, there were some very diverse authors like Thomas Paine, Malcolm X. You know, so they cast the net pretty wide, and it's pretty fair and even-handed. And so AA, the text AA, is considered to be, you know, almost one of the foundational texts of American culture. Time magazine also included it as in the top 100 most influential non-fiction books of the 20th century. Today, their influence is global. and I mention this merely to point out how effective it clearly is. So if I'm offering up an alternative to the woke, safety-obsessed, fragilizing, dissembling philosophy that's been imparted to a lot of young people today through universities, through counselling, through psychotherapy, through psychology, through TV, through magazines, and I'm offering an antidote, I need to show that it's successful, right? Well, these 12-step groups are extremely successful. And if you read The Atlantic or the Huffington Post, you get the impression that they aren't. The thing about 12-step groups is they don't tend to advertise themselves very much. In fact, it's part of their tradition to not do so. They also don't tend to inhabit university research departments as much as activist-driven academics who are pro-harm reduction and busy churning out lots of papers on how successful harm reduction is. These are voluntary groups composed of people who have no interest in doing that sort of thing. Nevertheless, their influence is global. Today, Alcoholics Anonymous has, 2 million active members worldwide, I think. The 12-step method obviously has been adopted by dozens, possibly actually hundreds, but certainly dozens of main parallel fellowships like Narcotics Anonymous, obviously, most people have heard of that, Cocaine Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous, to name just a few. One of the more amazing and miraculous examples of the success of this moral therapy approach to addiction, the addiction pandemic, which has pretty much, grabbed the world now, is its success in Iran. The success of Narcotics Anonymous in Iran is really something to behold. So I've got some stats here. So NA was founded in Iran in 1990, and it's now host, these stats are from the late 2010s, when they were saying it's now host to approximately 16,000 of the world's 60,000 meetings. So the USA has approximately 27,000 NA meetings, but Iran has 16,000. So apparently the NA program in Iran expanded massively in the 2010s in response to an addiction epidemic there, which was upwards of 2% of Iranians, I think, were addicted to illicit drugs, 60-odd% of those being opiates like heroin. But this kind of success, it is remarkable when you think of the fact that 12-step programs are voluntary organizations, unlike most NGOs. They receive no outside funding whatsoever. Nevertheless, this success has sort of been denied, twisted, propagandized against by people, not just people in the mental health establishment who've got political axis to grind, but also by the liberal press like the Huffington Post and the Atlantic, are two of the worst offenders. Throughout the 2010s, they seem to be just engaged in a sort of character assassination campaign of the 12-step movement and AA in particular. Just endless articles about how it doesn't work, how it's old-fashioned, how it's religious, like a cult, this sort of thing. But millions of people around the world are stopping using drugs and alcohol through these free organizations, right? Now you tell me how many people you know who got clean from drugs. I want you to show me one who got clean through CBT, who got clean off of fentanyl through meditating, somebody you know who stopped smoking meth through doing yoga, somebody you know who got off of all drugs and retrained and became an architect or something through a harm reduction program. You're not going to find anyone. You might find one. Now, especially Americans, you tell me, how many people you know have turned their lives around, currently clean and sober, they're a good mum or dad, they've held down a job for years and so on, who got it through a 12-step fellowship or another. most Americans will probably know dozens. Okay? The proof's in the pudding. We don't need a fancy university research department 5-year longitudinal study on the efficacy of methadone treatment. We don't need it. We can see the results with our own eyes. So this is very unfortunate because, largely beneath the scenes or behind the scenes, 12-step fellowships have kind of arguably done more than any other organization, any other methodology to provide the world with the solution for an incredibly destructive illness or social plague or whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to call addiction, whatever your opinion is. It's bad, it's getting worse, and 12-step fellowships are, without any shadow of a doubt, the only approach or method that has impacted in any way at all. There is no other modality that has had even a percentile of the effect that they've had. Right, so if it's that effective, then perhaps we should take notice of it and even ask questions like, does it have applications for ordinary people who aren't addicted? And I'd say potentially yes. So the traditional model of drug treatment was always along 12-step lines, and it was pretty effective. That's changing now. It's been sort of, as I said, unfairly maligned by sheltered academics and mental health professionals who've got no skin in the game. They're not addicts themselves. They don't know that much about it outside of addicts they meet in their professional capacity 9 to 5 for the last few years. They don't really have an idea of what's going on with the illness. And so my contention is that that they've attacked it for predominantly political and ideological reasons. There's a very vocal anti-12-step wing in mental health now. It's the majority, really. It has been for 20 years. I mean, you'll see things posted online like recovery is oppression. I saw a poster, a meme, or a poster, I think it was actually a poster that was being put up around Portland or somewhere along those lines. Recovery is oppression. In other words, don't tell people to stop using drugs, it's their right. And I would really question the motivations of somebody who's doing that, right? So that is a social justice model of health, right? And on that, just briefly, obviously social justice means different things to different people. I'm going to, as I use it, I would say it's justice not just in the form of sort of socioeconomic redistribution, recognition, respect, participation, that sort of thing. It goes beyond, for me, Marxist sort of economic theory to also include social, cultural inequalities as well. Its detractors obviously would say that it's just identity politics. It's the righting of kind of perceived inequalities within the context of a sort of hierarchy, like almost a totem pole of oppression. And that is what I see rolling out in addiction treatment. And I think addicts have been placed on that totem pole. They've got sort of a victim card. They've been handed a victim card for later use, should they need it, by social justice activists working within mental health. And I would say something like the majority, just pretty much the majority, I would say, of mental health professionals have some extreme sympathies with this idea. And it doesn't do addicts any good at all to give them a victim card. I know, I am one. We'll use it. We'll take that free card and run rings around you with that, right? So, and we can see it, which is why when you get recovering addicts who are mental health professionals, they tend to be much more savvy about the ill effects of doing something like that, right? So, but that's what I mean by social justice when I kind of throw the word out there. I'm talking about it not so much from an economic perspective as from this grouping of people into victim groups, right? And then for some reason allying with them and trying to be their friend, which is deeply suspect to me. So different identity groups get different victim points, and those who score higher on the victim scale get more respect and free passes than those who don't. And addicts are one of those groups now, have been for some time. I belong to that group. I do not accept this definition of who I am. I do not accept this social justice victim card. I would hand back my free victim pass. Thanks. Don't want that. This new fragility-obsessed social justice model is on the move. It's extremely disapproving of traditional 12-step abstinent-oriented methods of drug treatment because this social justice model is permissive. It wants everybody to be able to do everything, no holds barred. People should be left to use drugs as they wish and be less stigmatized or even supported while doing so. Which most of us, recovering addicts know it's enabling. It's a dreadful thing to do with addicted people, to sort of support them while they use. It is lethal, right? You give your son money for food when he's using fentanyl. You're not giving him money for food. You're giving him money for drugs. He's not going to spend it on food. So it's a deeply suspect vein that's running through mental health and addiction treatment now. So as it's becoming the predominant voice in psychology, psychotherapy, and increasingly addiction treatment, I want to look at how disastrous the results have been and what we should do instead, I guess, on this channel. That's the other thing that I'm doing. So a bit of background on me, I think, at this point. Right, so I started in my late teens to develop a serious drug problem, eventually got clean and sober when I was 28, and then in my 30s I started working in addiction treatment services. I started out as a harm reduction worker with chronic alcoholics and injecting drug users in North London, doing outreach work in North London. Harm reduction, as I've already mentioned, is a sort of a working policy protocol within drugs work that doesn't demand abstinence from its service users. It seeks to sort of support addicted people through their drug use, minimize the harms they cause to themselves. It's the perfect example of the fragility model of mental health in action, right? And you can see its failings all over the west coast of America. Don't need to go into that. I think everybody's seen that. According to the sort of victim ideology of social justice, mental health, then, drug use and homelessness are just sort of manifestations of oppression, poverty, deprivation, can't be punished, can't be interfered with in any way. And yeah, we can see the mess. Well, I was seeing that in London already in the 2000s. Like what happened in the 2010s in America, I'd already seen that in London, had enough. And I said, right, that's it, I'm off to Thailand. So I got out of the public sector and moved to Thailand, started a private rehab, right? So I founded one of the largest rehabs in the world. It became in the end. It will remain nameless for now, but that's what I did for 10 years. So what did I learn? I mean, I retired in 2019. I'm back in the game somewhat now, but those 2 decades, 2000s and 2010s, work in public sector, street outreach, harm reduction first, and private abstinence-based rehab for the second 10 years. What did I learn? Very diverse settings. One of them sort of ghetto, urban, poor in a Western city. The other one is private treatment, but extremely multicultural in that rehab that I owned and part-owned and ran. We had most of the nationalities on Earth, clients from most of the nationalities on Earth at one point or another. So there were very few islands, maybe some Pacific islands, small nation states. We didn't have clients from there. We had clients from absolutely every culture, every religion you can possibly imagine. So I've seen quite a lot of addicts through the years. I've probably worked with 7,000 or 8,000 in total. I've spoken to tens of thousands. Okay, and what I've learned is that abstinence works, right? Propping people up in their addictions usually doesn't, right? And mine would be a case in point. So for 15 pretty miserable years, I was an active addict. I couldn't control my drug use. and finally sort of left with no other choice, I totally abstained, and my life got better. That road back from existential boyhood, as it were, was not easy. Kind of having bailed on what should have been crucial stages of my psychosocial development. Through my teens and 20s, I was using drugs. I sort of woke up at 28 and found that I was a 13-year-old boy, right? Trapped in a 28-year-old man's body. And like a lot of recovering addicts, the question wasn't why do I use drugs? What happened to me? It was, how do I live? Right? How should I live? And the answer that I came to, and that almost all of my drug-using peers who had the same experience as I did also came to, is that I had to get 100% clean and sober, right? And when I started doing that, I found that large segments of society, especially the psychological professions, did not seem to agree. Life had wronged me, they said. No wonder I abuse drugs. You know, after all, look at the life you've had, so on and so forth. And it's like vast swathes of Western culture now seem to have kind of embraced this infantile reasoning, right? But what it is I think, they want you to know that they care, right? But the thing is, they wouldn't want to be like you themselves, right? So I find that disempowering, patronizing, and it's widespread. It's kind of sick-inducing to see it, but it's getting bigger. The only relevant question that model thinks to ask an addicted person is what happened to you. But that's faux compassion masquerading as care. It purports to unlock the door to amazing discoveries, but as far as I can see, it doesn't do anything of the kind. It doesn't get you anywhere. It just leads you into an empty room, right? So, yeah, that's a good analogy. So imagine that you're in an empty room, right? And there's a book on the table, and that book is called Why Society is the Problem, Not You. That's the book they want you to read. You kind of flip it open. First chapter's called something like How Your Parents Fucked You Up. And it's got a section on mums and a section on dads, and they make you read it. And then chapter 2 is kind of like how your grandparents fucked up your parents, and it goes on like that for a while, right? And then eventually comes to a chapter that's probably called something like Why Life is Unfair When It Shouldn't Be, and That's Terrible. This is the sort of knowledge that method contains. It goes no further than that. It's so imagine these kind of chapters, these kind of instructions outlining kind of a radical non-acceptance of your situation. Life sucks because people didn't give you what you needed, basically. If only people had given you what you needed, then paradisal environments would have ensued. And finally, you get to the end chapter, which is how to create idols or something like that. That's their book. That's all they've got for you, right? Now, that last chapter in particular would be pretty interesting because it would what they want you to envision is a world where nothing bad happens to anyone anymore. And you're going to like that conclusion because people do like that conclusion. They like it all the more because it doesn't ask anything of them. Okay? That's why it appeals. But here's the problem with that. It's like a shitty paperback that you get at an airport. You pick it up, you read it on the flight, it's garbage, you've got a load of factoids, but after reading it you feel kind of sick, like you've overdosed on sugar or something. Yeah, it got you through the flight, it gave you some self-knowledge, but you're going to discard that book as soon as you don't want to be bored anymore. And you won't retain anything in there. And the reason people like it is because it makes them feel better about their ugly bits. That kind of it's not your fault philosophy. I'm not saying it's all our fault. I'm saying that some parts of it will be, but this philosophy does not allow for that. So when I started to get clean in my late 20s, a lot of counselors and psychologists were trying to kind of give me that book, you know, the armchair book, as it were, the easy book. And I couldn't make any sense out of it because I liked it because it was about my favorite subject, which is myself, but it didn't help. And I started to see that it wasn't helping. It's just a fairy tale version of life, right? But that book has now become a bestseller, quite literally, in dozens of different formats. That book really appeals to the public imagination. And the reason why is because it proffers an easier, softer way. So that phrase itself is a concept in 12-step philosophy. You won't get clean and sober through easier, softer ways. And what they are things that are less objectionable to do to attain sobriety. You know, yoga and meditation, watching self-help videos, reading self-help books. Those things won't get you off drugs. It's not powerful enough. It doesn't demand enough of you. And eventually, you might get a few days or a few weeks up using easier, softer ways, but eventually they will fail you. Okay, because anything worth having is difficult, right? So that is really, I think, it's as simple as that. That's why it appeals, because these methods, you don't have to get clean and sober. You can stay on opioid maintenance medication. It's easier, and that's why it's popular. So there was a time when recovering alcoholics and addicts actually sort of, well, it still is a time, it still is a method of how recovering alcoholics and addicts take stock of the harms that they've done to others, not the harm that the world's done to them. That's in the 12-step method. So that's step 4 and 5 in particular, where you create a moral inventory of your behavior, not other people's behavior, right? So, and I've covered that briefly in another talk, resentment is a number one offender. We're looking for what we've done. So when Alcoholics Anonymous was first formed in 1939, they were very, very clear about this fact. Like, alcoholics came from every walk of life. Some had terrible childhoods, some had idyllic ones, but most were somewhere in between. But in essence, alcoholics and later addicts as well are no different to the wider population in this regard. It's not necessary to psychoanalyze ourselves, okay? Far from attributing addictive behavior to some kind of dysfunctional childhood, early AAs, Alcoholics Anonymous, learn to stay sober by seeing themselves as the problem and by assuming complete personal responsibility for their behavior. That's the way to stay sober. And there's a famous sort of pithy phrase that sort of captures that you'll hear in recovery circles is, while we judge ourselves by our intentions, the world judges us by our actions. That's just a truth, which a lot of people don't want to accept, but when you get into recovery, you have to accept. You have to accept that if you want to get clean and sober. But today, it just seems like everybody's psychoanalyzing themselves. We've become a kind of therapy generation. So, yeah, there seems to be a sort of industry of therapists, authors, academics, social media influencers, even medical bodies, where everybody's talking endlessly and voluminously about their childhood trauma. And this is even finding its way into 12-step fellowships now as well. Rehabs place trauma up front and center of their addiction treatment programs, but this is a dilution of the original message of 12-step groups that have arguably done more to get more addicted people clean through history than any other group, including probably the entire addiction treatment industry itself globally, right? And the original message from AA and other 12-step groups was, we don't need to psychoanalyze ourselves. We need to change the way we live. There is no easier, softer way, right? So it stands to reason then, in my mind, that recovering addicts are kind of harbingers, they're messengers, right? Recovering addicts know that the true they've found out through actual lived experience that the true prerequisite to a psychologically healthier life is change. But profound change requires a radical attitudinal shift. And that's only possible when I recognize that I am the problem. So you can't seriously sort of assert that everything would be okay if only the world did such and such. We've seen too much of that. We've seen too much of ourselves. We know that we're the monsters deep down. That's why we still call ourselves addicts. And that is the wisdom of addicts. If nothing else, we can see our own shadow. I mean, it's pretty hard to hide your shadow when you're an active addict. And when we get into recovery, that's only possible by continuing to retain the acknowledgement of that. You're not really saying, my name's Ali, I'm an addict. You're saying, my name's Ali, I've got a monster inside of me. Right? Which is true, unfortunately, of pretty much everyone. But with us, it cannot be hidden. It wasn't hidden. It was there for all to see, so there's no point denying it anyway. But the continued acknowledgement of that is extremely mentally healthy. And that's the wisdom of addicts.